Okay, so our presentation is on the Argentinian dictatorship of Jorge Rafael Videla and what is known as the national reorganization process. Just to introduce the dictatorship, it lasted from 1976 to 1981, and this was the period known as the national reorganization process. Videla ruled under military without Congress or president, so really no checks or balances. And he ruled with strict military repression. And this became known as the Dirty War, which was based on a very harsh, violent history with many human rights violations. So to cover the political and social happenings of the time, before 1976, the president was Isabel Perón. She ruled under the Judicialist Party, or PJ in Spanish, and it supported the working classes and the poorest sectors of the economy. It came to be known as Peronism, which essentially just sought equitable redistribution of wealth. Large support came from the General Confederation of Labor, which was Argentina's largest trade union. And when the coup happened in 1976, Videla led the military junta, and this is what began the national reorganization process, which was essentially restricting human rights, civil rights, democracy, and all opposing political parties. And we find it important to state that this was supported by the United States until 1982. Continuing with this, Videla's dictatorship became known as the Dirty War, which was essentially a campaign of terrorism against political opponents. And there were many human rights violations and civil rights violations. And Henry Kissinger, as you can see on the right, supported the coup and its aftermath, simply to denounce the socialist undertones of Peronism.
So to talk about some of the political violence of the regime, under this military junta, thousands of detention camps were set up to jail dissidents. The National Congress was closed, trade unions were banned, the state and municipal government were taken under military control, and extreme censorship was imposed. There were strict curfews and fear of the secret police. And the junta argued that it was fighting a civil war against leftist groups, but this changed in the late 1970s as there was growing evidence of human rights violations. An estimated between 13,000 and 15,000 people were killed, usually after being tortured, and at least another 10,000 were kidnapped and imprisoned for long periods of time during this regime.
There were numerous important actors in this regime and against this regime. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo was an association of mothers who had lost children and grandchildren to the Dirty War. And they used weekly Thursday afternoon vigils in the Plaza de Mayo, which was in front of the presidential palace, to call international attention to the desaparecidos. And these vigils continued until 2006. And then we have the PRP, which was a Marxist political party founded in 1965 that combined two previous leftist parties. And the ERP, which was the military arm of the PRT. And together, these parties essentially went to war against Videla's regime, using assassinations and kidnappings and robbery, among other tactics. Adolfo Pérez Esquivel was a very vocal critic of the violence from both the right and the left, and spoke up on behalf of the desaparecidos. And he was also Secretary General of Peace and Justice, which was like a human rights organization. And then Emilio Eduardo Macera and Orlando Rossi also were part of Videla's regime in the Navy and the Air Force. And then a few more people, Emilio Fermín Buñón, also fought on behalf of the desaparecidos, and he was one of Argentina's leading human rights advocates. General Roberto Viola succeeded Videla in 1981, and then he was followed by General Leopoldo Galtieri. He was then followed by General Reinaldo Viñón. And then finally, the Unión Cívica Radical was a major center-left party, which ended the dictatorship in 1983 with the election of Raúl Alfonsín. He announced plans to prosecute several members of the military junta and repeal the law that granted amnesty to those who were accused of crimes against humanity. And he later pushed 2 amnesty laws through Congress. So kind of a mixed bag of action on his part.
Yeah, so Part of the ideological and geopolitical circumstances during the junta constitute basically the country after the coup in 1976 had a lot of neoliberal tendencies modeled after sort of Western powers like the US and Germany. And as a result, this model required lots of investment from these powers in order to stimulate the economy. And while this was conducted through an authoritative and violent regime, Videla was praised by Germany and even the US at times for encouraging the influx of capital. And in effect, the government had an exploitative capitalist stance on the economy, trying to silence these anti-poverty groups, trade unions, and generally peaceful but leftist activists who wanted better working conditions. And Videla's government was radically conservative against this, pushing for the repression of these leftist guerrilla groups who opposed the regime, and sort of this idea of civilization versus barbarism, trying to defend Catholicism. And then next slide. Although the previous US president up until 1976, Gerald Ford, had a healthy relationship with the Argentine regime due to its anti-communist leanings, Carter was very frustrated by the way they had been treating their people. And so eventually Carter's State Department basically gave them a bunch of economic sanctions as a result, although there was a loan later agreed upon contingent on Videla's compliance with the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. They also held the 1978 World Cup during this period, and there was this idea of trying to present a clean image of the country, even though there was a lot of bad stuff going behind the scenes, a lot of propaganda, this idea of like quasi-fascist kind of nationalist music being conducted, and people dressed in civilian clothing.
So a few of the opposition groups and discourses that we've talked about included the Peronists, based on the ideas and legacy of Juan Perón, who was a previous presidential regime. And this generally supported social justice programs and benefit the working class and labor unions. They were for additional involvement of the state in the economy. And the death of this president is what left a weak state behind, in which his wife assumed presidency and then was overthrown by Videla's regime. Additional opponents included that we've already spoken of, but leftists, Marxists, and communists, generally supporting social equality and egalitarianism. And another group we've also mentioned was the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. These mothers would call international attention to the crimes against humanity committed by Videla's regime. And I believe that will conclude our presentation on yes.